Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The sinister advertisement. It all started one Friday afternoon when I first saw it, the ad. It appeared out of nowhere on the side of my phone screen while I was scrolling through social media. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another advertisement, like the thousands that pop up every day. But this one was different. It wasn't for a product or a service. It didn't even have any recognizable logo. Just bold, cryptic words. Do what they say. No questions. No hesitation. The time has come. I didn't think about it much at first. After all, it was just an ad, right? But something about those words lingered in my mind. The odd phrasing. The urgency. It felt like I was being told something important. That night, I couldn't shake the thought. It was just an ad, I told myself again and again. But why did it keep replaying in my mind? I found myself glancing at my phone more often than usual, hoping I'd see something else. But there it was again. That same ad, repeating itself in my feed like it was meant to be there. Do what they say. No questions. No hesitation. The time has come. And then, something strange happened. I felt a strange compulsion to follow its instructions. It was subtle at first, like a whisper, pushing me to click the ad. So, I did. I wasn't sure why, but I just couldn't resist. When I clicked on it, the screen went black for a moment. Then a series of numbers flashed quickly across the screen, followed by an address, 4827 Cypress Lane. Then it was gone. The screen returned to normal. But I felt different. Like something had changed inside me. The next day, I started noticing strange things. My coworkers, who were always energetic and cheerful, seemed distant. Some of them looked pale, their eyes unfocused. I overheard one of them murmuring under her breath, repeating the words from the ad, "Do what they say." I dismissed it as a coincidence, but I couldn't help the growing unease in my stomach. That evening, I tried to forget about the ad, but it kept resurfacing in my mind. I told myself to focus on something else, work, dinner, anything. Yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words flashing across the black screen. The address. And that nagging feeling that I needed to go there. I had never been one for superstition, and I sure didn't believe in conspiracy theories. But something in me told me I had to go to Cypress Lane. It wasn't long before others began to do the same. A friend of mine, Carla, who had never mentioned the ad, called me that evening. She was panicked, breathless. "I don't know what's happening," she said. "I'm at the address. It's real. It's here. And something's wrong." The phone call cut off abruptly. I was terrified, but at the same time, I felt an irresistible pull toward that same address. I told myself it would be okay, that I could find Carla, and we could figure this out together. But deep down, I knew that going to Cypress Lane would change everything. I was already part of something bigger, something I couldn't understand. As I left my apartment that evening, a chilling realization gripped me. I wasn't the only one who had felt this pull. Across town, Others were answering the same call, and none of us knew what awaited us at the end of the journey. I didn't know what I expected when I arrived at Cypress Lane. Maybe it was the mundane look of the street that made this situation feel more surreal. The neighborhood appeared perfectly ordinary. Neat houses with freshly painted fences, lawns trimmed to perfection, and the soft murmur of distant conversations spilling from porches. But something about the stillness seemed off. As I drove down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though no one was in sight, there was an overwhelming sense of being watched. I tried to rationalize it. It was late, and most people were probably indoors. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. It felt like the houses themselves were silently observing me, waiting for something. I parked in front of the address, 4827 Cypress Lane, and sat in my car for a moment. The house was modest, nothing special about it. No grand design or peculiar features, just a typical two-story home. But it was eerily silent, even though I was sure someone had been here recently. The windows were dark, but there was a slight flicker of movement behind one of them, a shadow crossing over the curtain. I swallowed hard and stepped out of the car, my heart pounding. As I approached the door, I noticed the strange hum that seemed to fill the air. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, like the sound of electronics running at full capacity, buzzing softly just under the threshold of hearing. I reached for the doorbell, hesitated, then pressed it. The door swung open before I could pull my hand away. There was no one there. No lights. No movement. Just the open door, waiting. I stepped inside, feeling an intense pull, as though I were being guided by an unseen hand. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the hum in the air grew louder. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I was no longer alone. "Carla?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I stepped further into the house, scanning the dark hallways. It felt wrong. The air was thick, charged, and the walls seemed to press in around me. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, facing away from me. A woman, her back to me, but I knew it was Carla. I could feel it in my gut. "Carla?" I whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. She didn't move. I stepped closer, calling her name again. And this time, she turned. Her eyes were wide and vacant. There was no recognition in her expression, just an eerie emptiness. "Do what they say," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if she were speaking through a veil. Before I could react, she turned and walked down the hall, her movements stiff, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. I felt my pulse quicken. The ad. The words. The instructions. I turned back to the front door, ready to leave, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash. My heart raced as I tried the handle, locked. Panic surged through me, and I banged my fist against the door, shouting for help. But the only sound that answered was the increasing hum in the air, louder now, vibrating through my chest. I spun around. The house had changed. It was as if the walls were shifting, the rooms expanding, like the house itself was breathing. The very foundation seemed to grow unstable. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the living room, there was a television, its screen flickering to life, glowing an unnatural shade of pale blue. The words appeared on the screen, bold and demanding, "Do what they say." No questions. No hesitation. The time has come. I couldn't tear my eyes away, as though my very will was being consumed by the screen. Something inside me screamed to look away, to run. But the message felt like a command I could not resist. I stepped closer, hypnotized. The room seemed to tilt around me, and the now deafening, filled every corner of my mind. I didn't know why, but I reached for the remote beside the television, and my hand hovered over the button. It was as though I was no longer in control of my own body. "Do it," a voice whispered in my ear, a voice that wasn't mine. With a trembling finger, I pressed the button. The moment my finger touched the button, the television screen flickered violently, casting an eerie glow across the room. The hum in the air grew deafening, like a swarm of insects had descended, buzzing frantically in my ears. My heart pounded in my chest as the words on the screen changed, now flashing rapidly, one after the other. "You have been chosen. Follow the instructions. Do not resist." The words burned into my mind, and the strange compulsion that had gripped me tightened its hold. My limbs felt like they were moving of their own accord. I tried to stop, to fight against whatever invisible force was controlling me, but it was as though I were a marionette and the strings had been pulled too taut. I stumbled backward, my feet dragging me toward the door. No matter how hard I tried to turn around, my body wouldn't obey. The voice, the whispering voice that I now recognized as my own, echoed in my mind. "Follow the instructions. Do what they say." The door opened before I could even reach for the handle. It swung wide, the same invisible force pulling me through it. I stumbled out onto the front porch, blinking against the sharp sunlight that cut through the thick, oppressive air. The street outside looked different. Everything was too still. No cars passed by, no distant laughter, no sounds of children playing. The usual hum of a neighborhood was gone, replaced by a strange silence that made my skin crawl. The houses on either side of me seemed to lean in, their windows like dark eyes staring, unblinking. Then, the screen of the television flickered again, this time projecting a new set of instructions. "Turn left. Walk to the end of the street." The commands came with an almost physical force. I couldn't resist. My feet carried me down the sidewalk, my movements stiff, as if I were being led by an unseen hand. My eyes glazed over as I walked, my thoughts fragmented. The neighborhood seemed endless, but it wasn't. The more I walked, the more the houses felt like they were shifting, as though the street was expanding, pulling me further and further into its grip. By the time I reached the end of the street, I felt dizzy, as though the world had tilted on its axis. The sun overhead seemed to flicker in and out, as if reality itself was cracking, splintering under the pressure of whatever was controlling me. At the end of the road, there was a small park. An empty swing set sat silently under the shade of a large oak tree, the chains swaying lightly in the breeze. It looked completely out of place in this bizarre, unnatural world. The instructions on the screen changed once again. Sit on the swing. Wait for the others. My body obeyed without hesitation. I sat down on the swing, the metal seat cold against my skin, and the moment I did, a chill ran through me. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, and the whispering voice that had been guiding me was growing louder, more insistent, until it filled my entire mind. I glanced around, but there was no one else. The park was empty. The street was empty. I was alone. Or was I? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned my head to the side. In the distance, I saw figures approaching. At first, they were just shadows, barely visible in the periphery of my vision. But as they got closer, I could make out their features. They were people, but not the people I knew. Their faces were blank, expressionless, eyes vacant and dull. They walked in a perfect line, synchronized in their movements. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet rustling of their footsteps in the gravel as they approached. And then they stopped. Each one stood silently in front of me, like a row of mannequins waiting for their cue. A new command appeared on the screen. Join them. The figures in front of me moved as one. They began to walk towards a nearby building, a small, decrepit shack that had appeared out of nowhere. Its door stood wide open, dark and inviting. I knew what I had to do. My body, under the control of whatever force was pulling the strings, followed them without question. We all entered the shack together. The inside was dim, lit only by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered with strange symbols, scrawled hastily as though someone had tried to erase them, but they had bled through the paint. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror. It was old, cracked in places, but still gleaming. The figures lined up before it, and one by one, they turned to face it. I felt the pull again, the urge to approach the mirror. I couldn't resist. Something told me I had to look. Something told me I would find the answers there. As I stepped toward the mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. But it wasn't me. The reflection that stared back had a twisted, distorted version of my face. My eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and my lips were stretched into a grotesque grin. I gasped, recoiling. The reflection grinned back, its eyes gleaming with malice. "Welcome," the voice whispered from the depths of the mirror. "You're home now." And that was when I understood. The advertisement hadn't just manipulated us, it had trapped us. And now, it was too late. I was never meant to leave. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figures standing around me, their faces blank, slowly began to move in unison. It was as if they were performing a ritual, a strange, synchronized dance. Each step they took, each motion they made, was done with terrifying precision. Their eyes never left the mirror. I tried to look away, to escape, but the mirror's grip was too strong. It pulled me closer, drawing me toward its surface, as if it were calling to me, speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. I could feel the air around me grow thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in. The figure closest to me, an elderly man, turned slowly, his eyes empty and hollow, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lips moved, however, and I could almost hear a faint whisper beneath the hum of the room. He reached out a hand toward me, his fingers trembling. I stepped back instinctively, but my body wouldn't respond the way I wanted. It wasn't mine anymore. I felt like a spectator trapped in my own skin. My hand stretched out involuntarily, reaching toward the mirror as if it had a mind of its own. The moment my fingertips brushed the surface of the glass, I was jolted forward, my body slamming into the cold, smooth surface with a violent force. For a second, everything went black. A rush of images, sounds, and sensations overwhelmed my mind, like 1,000 voices shouting in unison. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the chaos. And then, the world settled. I was no longer in the shack. Instead, I was standing in a vast, darkened void. The air was thick with a heavy, unnatural stillness, as if time itself had stopped. The only thing that existed here was the mirror, towering, massive, reflecting nothing but darkness. I couldn't see myself, or the figures, or anything else. It was as if I was trapped in a place between worlds. "You are here," the voice whispered again, softer this time, but its presence was overwhelming. "You are part of it now." I tried to speak, to ask what this place was, but my mouth wouldn't form the words. Instead, the mirror before me began to shift, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Slowly, images began to appear. At first, they were small, blurry fragments, snippets of faces, scenes that made no sense, like a broken reel of film. Then, the images focused. I saw family, laughing and playing in their front yard. They looked happy, carefree. But something was wrong. The scene began to distort, the family's smiles stretching unnaturally wide, their eyes empty and lifeless. The laughter turned to a high-pitched shriek, and the image shattered, replaced by something else. A man, standing alone in the middle of a street, staring blankly at the camera. His face was covered in a strange, pulsing rash, and his body shook violently. I could hear him screaming, but his mouth wasn't moving. It was as if the scream was being transmitted directly into my brain, rattling my thoughts, tearing at my sanity. The image warped again, and now I saw the same man, but his body was no longer human. It had been twisted, deformed, and I could see his eyes, no longer human, but something otherworldly, staring at me through the glass. The mirror wasn't showing me the past, it was showing me what would happen to everyone who fell under the advertisement spell. The transformation. The corruption. The figures in the room with me had begun to shift, too. Their movements were no longer synchronized, but jerky, unnatural, as though they were fighting against an invisible force. I could see their faces now, twisted in fear and confusion, their bodies writhing as if they were trying to break free from the grip of the mirror. But it was too late. They were already lost. A sharp pain shot through my skull, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. I gasped for air, as if the very act of breathing was suddenly foreign. The whispering voice returned, now louder, almost deafening. "You can't escape." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned, looking desperately for a way out, but there was nothing. The void stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no exit. No escape. Only the mirror and the horror it showed. A new image appeared in the glass, one that made my blood run cold. It was me. A distorted version of myself, standing in front of the mirror just as I was now, but with eyes wide and empty, a grotesque grin plastered across my face. I could feel the pull, the inevitable force that would drag me into the same fate as the others. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. "You are part of the cycle now," the voice said, almost lovingly. "You will join them." In the reflection, I saw my own face stretch and contort, my features becoming something alien, monstrous. I felt my mind slipping away, my control over myself fading. The instructions, the compulsion, they were becoming stronger, clearer. "Go back," the voice urged. "It's time to finish the task." I wanted to fight it. I wanted to scream, to do anything to stop this nightmare from consuming me. But I knew, deep down, that it was already too late. My body moved of its own accord, as if I was nothing more than a spectator trapped inside my own skin. The voice in the void, the force pulling me, it was all-consuming. There was no resisting it. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into something dark, something irreversible. The mirror before me loomed larger, its surface now alive, throbbing with a sinister energy that I couldn't explain. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were locked on the reflection. My reflection. It was no longer me. It was a shell of who I was, its smile grotesque, its eyes hollow and empty. The version of myself in the mirror reached out, as if inviting me to join it. "You can't escape," the voice repeated, this time not as a whisper but a commanding presence, filling the very air around me. "It's too late." The compulsion grew stronger. I could feel it pulling at my very soul, forcing me to obey. Every movement I made felt unnatural, alien. But I couldn't stop. I stepped closer to the mirror, my reflection mimicking me, its movements smooth and assured. It felt like the mirror was not a reflection at all, but a gateway, a door to something far worse. Suddenly, I realized what was happening. The mirror wasn't just showing the future, it was rewriting it. It had the power to alter reality, to twist the fates of those who were exposed to it. The people who had seen the advertisement were no longer themselves. They were now part of whatever force controlled the mirror. They were becoming the reflections, the puppets. And I was next. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered above the glass. It felt like the mirror was pulling me in, inviting me to step through. My breath hitched and panic surged through me. I had to resist. I had to break free. But then, the voice spoke again, this time more soothing, like a lullaby meant to calm the mind. "It's inevitable," it crooned. "You will join them. You will be part of the cycle." I felt a pressure in my chest, the weight of 1,000 thoughts pressing down on me, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. The images in the mirror flickered, showing me faces, people I had never met, but their eyes, their blank, hollow eyes, were now looking at me through the glass. They were the lost souls of those who had fallen victim to the advertisement, their minds consumed by whatever force controlled it. "Let go," the voice urged. "Embrace your purpose. Embrace the task." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body refused. I couldn't stop it. My hand, now no longer mine, reached for the mirror's surface, and in that instant, I felt the cold glass against my skin. The moment my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through my entire body. It wasn't just physical, it was as if my very essence was being torn apart. The world around me began to warp, twisting and contorting like a nightmare unraveling. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, I wasn't in the void anymore. I was back in the shack, on the cold floor, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, my body drenched in sweat. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. I could hear the faint whispers around me, the same whispers from the mirror. I knew I hadn't escaped. I looked up, and there they were, the figures. They had returned, standing silently in the corners of the room, their eyes vacant, staring at me with that same eerie emptiness. I felt the pull again, that overwhelming force. The mirror was gone. But I knew, deep in my soul, that the advertisement wasn't finished. It had consumed me, and it would consume others. It would never stop. The cycle would continue, feeding on the helpless, on those who couldn't resist. I tried to stand, but my body refused to obey. The compulsion was too strong. I had no control anymore. The last thing I remember was the voice, now clearer than ever, echoing in my mind, soothing yet terrifying. "Welcome back," it whispered. "You have a task to complete." And then, I was gone. The world around me faded into the reflection of a distorted smile. The advertisement had claimed another victim. remnants of civilization. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was nothing more than the wind. A low rustle, like dry leaves scraping across the ground, carried by the breeze. But the wind hadn't picked up. It was an odd, still evening in Texas, the kind that makes the air feel thick, almost suffocating. The ranch had always been quiet at night, the distant hum of the highway muted by the vast open plains. I'd worked at this place for 3 years now, long enough to know its rhythms. But that evening was different. The air seemed charged, like something was just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting. I had always considered myself a logical person. I grew up on farms, surrounded by hard, physical work and straightforward tasks. I never gave much thought to ghost stories or unexplained phenomena. But that evening, as I stood by the barn, the sound came again. This time, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a deliberate noise, almost like the scraping of metal on stone. My eyes darted to the darkened corner of the barn where the old, crumbling stone wall met the wooden beams. It was an odd feature of the property, this wall. The ranch had been passed down through generations, but no one ever spoke of the wall. It wasn't part of any blueprint, not mentioned in any of the records. It was as if it had always been there, a relic of some forgotten time. I was about to turn and head inside when I heard it again, a sharp, distinct sound. A tapping. A rhythmic tapping, coming from behind the wall. At first, I thought it was an animal. A rodent maybe, digging through the dirt. But then it stopped. And the silence that followed felt unnatural, oppressive. I stepped forward, my boots crunching against the gravel as I approached the barn door. My hand froze on the handle. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt heavier, like something was watching me. The night had fallen still, too still. I should have gone inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the unease gnawing at me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward the old wall, as if it was calling to me. Slowly, I moved closer, my heart beginning to race. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from beneath the earth, I realized. From below the foundation. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the cool stone. For a moment, all I could hear was the thudding of my own pulse in my ears, drowning out the faint sound of the tapping. But then it came again, louder this time, like something was scraping its way through the stone itself. I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt from my knees. My mind raced to explain the noise. A construction tool, a piece of machinery, anything other than what I was beginning to fear. But there was nothing out of place. The barn was as silent as it had always been, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling through the long grass outside. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a small object half buried in the dirt. I knelt again, brushing away the earth to reveal a rusted, ancient-looking metal ring. My fingers trembled as I ran them over its surface. The ring was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. The tapping stopped. The air around me seemed to freeze, holding its breath. "Get out of there," I whispered to myself, but my body wouldn't obey. My gaze was fixed on the ring, the strange markings etched into it, half hidden by dirt. I reached down and tugged at it, but it didn't budge. The sound returned, a low, grinding scrape, like something ancient and heavy was shifting beneath the earth. My heartbeat quickened. I stood, stepping back, my mind racing. The unease in my chest spread like wildfire. There was something down there, something old, something that had been waiting. Before I could take another step, the ground beneath me trembled. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, but then it grew stronger. The earth seemed to groan as if waking from a long slumber. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around in search of something, anything that could explain this sensation. But the only thing I could see was the dark, oppressive sky above me. I didn't know why I felt that sudden, irrational need to leave. But I did. Without a second thought, I turned and sprinted for the house. My breath was shallow, my mind flooded with confusion and fear. By the time I reached the porch, I was gasping for air, my pulse racing. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm myself. The sounds from the barn were fading, but the unsettling feeling remained, creeping through my veins like poison. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the noise of the night, a trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Something was out there. And it was just getting started. The next few days felt like a slow descent into madness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the land, with the ranch itself. Every corner of the property felt oppressive, as if the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And it wasn't just the barn. The entire ranch, once a familiar and comforting place, now seemed different. Changed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress, the pressure of managing the land alone while the owner, a distant relative, was away. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion at the back of my mind. There was something about that wall, about the strange tapping sound, that I couldn't explain. The morning after I found the ring, I decided to investigate further. I needed to understand what was happening before the fear took over completely. I had to know if it was just my imagination running wild or if there was something real, something dangerous, lurking beneath the surface. I returned to the barn early, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The quiet of the morning was eerie, the world still wrapped in shadows. I approached the wall again, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of what had caused the noise. The earth around the stone wall was undisturbed, the ground solid beneath my boots. But as I crouched down, I noticed something. The ring I had found the night before was gone. I stood up quickly, looking around in confusion. My breath caught in my throat. There was no sign of it. No trace, no imprint in the dirt where I had uncovered it. It was as if it had never been there at all. Panic rose in my chest. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but the chill I felt in my bones told me otherwise. I could still feel the cold metal under my fingers, still hear the scrape of the earth as I'd uncovered it. I leaned in closer to the stone wall, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers brushed against the rough surface, feeling for any sign of movement. And that's when I felt it, a faint vibration, as though something deep below was stirring. I pulled my hand back quickly, my breath hitching. It was the same sensation I had felt the night before, only stronger now, more pronounced. It wasn't my imagination. The wall, the ground, it was alive. A voice inside me screamed to leave, to run, to get as far away as possible. But instead, I pressed on. My eyes darted around the barn, looking for something, anything, that could explain this. But there was nothing. The barn was as silent as ever. I returned to the house, my mind racing, the need to understand growing stronger by the second. I didn't want to be alone. I needed to talk to someone, to share this with someone who could tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But as the day wore on, I realized something else. I was alone. My phone, usually reliable, had been acting up lately, cutting in and out. There was no one to call. No one to ask for help. That night, as the sky turned dark and the wind began to pick up, I went back to the barn. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to find answers. The tapping had stopped, but the vibrations beneath the ground had only intensified. Now, they seemed to pulse through the air, resonating in my chest like a heartbeat. I walked slowly toward the wall, my mind filled with questions, doubts. What was down there? What was waiting for me beneath the earth? And then I heard it, the tapping again, faint at first, like a distant knock on wood. It came from deep inside the stone, as though something was trying to break free. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My fingers tingled with fear. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but my legs refused to move. The sound grew louder, sharper, as if something was scraping its way up from beneath the earth. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shook again, more violently this time. The barn groaned with the pressure, the beams rattling as though they were straining to hold back something immense. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, and for a moment, I thought I saw it, a shadow, just beyond the edge of my vision. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing near the barn door. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat as I looked back at the wall. The tapping had stopped, but the vibrations were stronger than ever. I could feel the earth trembling beneath my feet, as though the very ground itself was alive, restless. The barn seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. I couldn't stay here anymore. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything I could understand. But as I turned to leave, the ground beneath me trembled once more. And then, with a deafening crack, the earth split open. I barely had time to react. The ground gave way beneath me, and I was falling, tumbling down into the darkness. I woke to darkness. A thick, suffocating blackness that clung to me like a second skin. My body ached, my head spinning with confusion. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, or how I had gotten there. The last thing I remembered was the ground beneath me splitting open, the earth giving way like a trapdoor. I tried to move, but pain shot through my limbs. My hands scrambled across the dirt, feeling for something solid to hold on to. Everything around me felt wrong. The air was still, heavy with a dampness I couldn't place. The darkness was absolute, no faint glow from the stars above, no soft flicker of moonlight. Just the kind of void that made you question if you were truly alive or lost to something far worse. I inhaled sharply, the air thick with dust and something else, a faint, musty scent that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of decay, of something ancient. My fingers brushed against stone, cold and smooth. Slowly, I pulled myself up, my knees shaking as I tried to get my bearings. Where am I? I couldn't answer the question. The ground was uneven, like a cave or a forgotten underground structure. My fingers slid over the stone walls, trying to find a way out, but the surface was slick, almost polished. I couldn't make sense of it. How could this be beneath the barn? Beneath the ranch? Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt it again, the vibration. It was faint, like the hum of an old machine, but it was there. A low, throbbing pulse beneath the earth, as if something was moving, something large and ancient, just beyond my reach. I pressed my hand to the stone wall, trying to steady my breath. This was impossible. The barn wasn't supposed to be connected to something like this. There was no record of any underground structures, no mention of caverns or tunnels in the history of the ranch. But here I was, standing in the middle of something that felt wrong in every way. I could feel the weight of it in my bones, the suffocating sense that I wasn't supposed to be here. And then I heard it. A low murmur, like the soft whisper of voices, echoing through the darkness. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was subtle, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Voices. I stumbled backward, my pulse quickening, my mind racing for a logical explanation. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the sound of water moving through the earth. There had to be a reasonable explanation. But then the whisper grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many. I held my breath, my chest tight with fear. The voices seemed to come from all around me, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. The words were too muffled, too distant to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. There was an urgency to them, a warning. The vibration beneath me intensified, shaking the ground with greater force. The air felt charged now, as if the very atmosphere was alive with energy. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some form of light, some connection to the outside world. But the screen was cracked, unresponsive, as though it had been damaged during the fall. I was completely alone. The ground shifted beneath me again, and this time it wasn't just a tremor. The stones around me groaned, as if they were alive, moving under the pressure. The voices rose to a deafening roar, a cacophony of unintelligible words that filled my head with panic. The vibrations pulsed through me, and I could feel them in my chest, in my teeth, in my very bones. And then I saw it. A shape. A shadow, darker than the darkness itself, moving through the space ahead of me. It was slow at first, like something ancient awakening after centuries of slumber. But as it drew closer, I could make out the faint outline of a figure. Tall, towering, and twisted in form, it seemed to shimmer and waver in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, becoming almost deafening now, a flood of unintelligible words. I wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get away, but my legs were paralyzed. The figure moved closer, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, heavier. The ground beneath me groaned again, and I stumbled back, my feet catching on something, a stone, a root, something unseen, and I fell. I landed hard, my hands scraping against the rough stone floor as I struggled to get up. The figure was almost on top of me now. I could hear its breath, or what sounded like breathing, slow and heavy, echoing in the darkness. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then I saw its eyes. Two glowing orbs, faintly shimmering in the darkness, locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. They weren't eyes like a person's, but something far older, far more terrifying. They seemed to see straight through me, to pierce into the depths of my soul. For a moment, I could only stare, paralyzed by fear. And then, as if by some unspoken command, the earth beneath me seemed to rise up. The ground trembled, and the walls around me shifted, closing in. I had no idea where I was, or how I was going to escape. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't alone anymore. And whatever was down here, it was waiting for me. I don't remember how long I lay there, staring at those eyes. Time seemed to stretch, distorted and endless, as the creature before me hovered, its presence consuming the air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched those eyes, cold, ancient, and calculating. The air around me grew colder, like frost was slowly creeping along the walls, and the whispers intensified, now more distinct. They weren't just murmurs anymore, they were words. The voices were speaking to me, chanting in a language I didn't understand, their cadence rhythmic and hypnotic. The figure moved closer, its form more defined now, though still shrouded in shadow. Its shape was unnatural, almost fluid, as though it could shift in and out of reality itself. I forced myself to blink to break the trance. It wasn't just the eyes. There was something else, something beneath the surface, deep in the darkness, pulling at me. A pull so strong I could feel it in my very core. It was as if the earth itself was alive, waiting for me to give in, to submit to whatever force had awakened. I pushed myself up onto shaky legs, trembling from fear, but determined not to let this thing take me without a fight. Every part of me screamed to run, but I had no idea which direction to go. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, disorienting me. I had no idea if there was any escape, if there was any way out of this living nightmare. But as I turned to look, I noticed something in the distance, something that hadn't been there before. Faint light, flickering like a dying flame. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me direction. My instincts took over, and I moved toward it, careful not to make any sound. The ground beneath me was uneven, jagged stone cutting into my skin as I stumbled over it, but I couldn't afford to stop. The shadows followed me. I could feel them pressing in, like they were alive, clawing at me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand but that I felt deep in my bones. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be fading into the dark, but the presence lingered. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Waiting for me to fall, waiting for me to give in. I reached the light. It wasn't a flame, but a faint glow coming from something embedded in the stone. As I knelt closer, my breath catching in my throat, I saw what it was, an inscription. Ancient markings carved deep into the stone, glowing with an eerie light. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen before, their shapes intricate, almost alien. They pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, like they were alive, beating with the same vibration that seemed to echo through the earth. I could feel the weight of it all. This place. This stone. It wasn't just an underground chamber. It was a tomb. A place of worship. Or something worse. The voices were louder now, almost deafening, their words growing more insistent. They weren't just speaking, they were screaming, pleading for something. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It felt like a warning. A warning about what? About me? About this place? About what had been buried here? As my fingers traced the markings, I felt a sudden jolt, a shock that shot through my body, making my muscles spasm. I pulled my hand back in shock, but the glow of the symbols only intensified, brighter now, almost blinding. The ground beneath me trembled again, the walls shaking with an inhuman force. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. A sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth, deep and primal. The creature. It was close now. Too close. I spun around, my eyes frantically searching for any sign of movement. The darkness was closing in, the air thick with pressure. The whispers had turned to shouts, the voices rising in panic as if they were trying to warn me. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. But just as I turned to run, I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. The same figure. But now, it was different. Its form was no longer a fluid shape, it was solid, defined. It loomed over me, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. And then it spoke. The voice was deep, like the rumble of thunder, and it echoed in my mind as much as in the air. It wasn't a language I recognized. It wasn't even a human voice. It was older, like something far beyond my understanding. You should not have come. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. My heart skipped a beat as terror washed over me. I turned and ran, blindly stumbling through the darkness, my legs burning with the effort. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The only thing I knew was that I had to get away. The ground continued to shake beneath me, and I heard it, its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me, never letting up. The whispers grew louder, faster, their frantic shouts mingling with the growls and the thudding of its steps. I was being hunted. I reached the edge of the chamber, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic. A door? A way out? I didn't know. I didn't care. I shoved against it with all my strength, desperate for escape. But the door didn't move. And then I heard it again, the voice. You cannot leave. You are already part of it. I gasped, my hand frozen against the cold stone. The ground beneath me trembled, and for a moment I thought I felt something pulling at my feet, like the earth itself was reaching for me, dragging me back into the depths. I didn't understand. My mind raced, panicked, trying to make sense of what was happening. What was pulling me, dragging me into the depths? The darkness around me seemed to pulse with an almost malicious rhythm, like a beating heart. The voice, the growls, the earth itself, all of it was alive, a living nightmare that I couldn't escape. I pushed harder against the door, my hands slick with sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the stone was immovable. Whatever ancient force held this place together was stronger than anything I could muster. I was trapped. I turned, my back pressed against the cold, unyielding surface of the stone door. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the dark. I could feel the creature's presence drawing nearer, its very essence pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. The whispers had quieted, replaced now by a low hum, a vibration that seemed to reverberate through the walls, through the very air. You cannot leave, the voice repeated, but this time there was something else, something more. It was a truth, a declaration, not a warning. The creature knew. It knew what I was. The vibrations beneath my feet grew stronger, shaking the ground with terrifying force. I fell to my knees, clutching the stone in desperation. My mind spun with confusion. The inscription, the markings on the walls, they weren't just symbols. They were a message. A seal, a binding of something ancient, something that had been buried here for a reason. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't supposed to be here. That whatever was buried beneath the earth had waited long enough, and now it was ready to rise again. The creature's presence grew overwhelming, its energy suffusing the space, filling every inch of the chamber. I could feel it moving closer, like an animal sensing its prey, its hunger almost palpable. I was too weak to fight it. I had no answers, no way to stop it. But then, something shifted. The vibrations, once chaotic and powerful, suddenly aligned into a rhythm, consistent, like the beating of a heart. A single, steady pulse. And with that pulse, I felt it, the ground beneath me began to sink, just slightly, as if responding to the presence above. A shift in the world, a quiet tremor that seemed to answer the creature's call. And I understood. The markings, the whispers, the vibrations, they were a part of it. The stone walls were part of a mechanism. A trap. A seal that had been broken. This was never just a cave or a tomb. It was a prison. And now the prison was crumbling. I could hear the growl of the creature, closer now, louder, like it was right behind me. Its breath came in sharp, rasping gasps, its presence filling the air. But I had no more strength to run. No more will to fight. You cannot leave, the voice repeated, the tone now filled with a sickening certainty. I turned toward it. The creature stood in front of me, its form taking shape in the dim glow of the symbols. The air around it shimmered, a distortion of reality. Its body was like shadow, shifting in impossible ways, but its eyes, the same glowing orbs I had seen before, were locked on mine. I could feel it pulling at me, its gaze dragging my very soul toward it. The fear, the terror, it was suffocating. It wasn't just the physical horror of the creature before me. It was the knowledge of what it represented. What it had been. I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't just its prey. I was its final piece. Its prisoner. Its new vessel. It was using me, pulling me into its grasp. The ground beneath me groaned, and the pulse of the ancient symbols quickened. The earth itself seemed to shudder, as if awakening from a long slumber. I felt the pull stronger now, like the very earth beneath me was reaching for me, ready to consume me whole. I reached for the markings, my fingers trembling as they brushed the glowing symbols. The moment I touched them, a surge of energy shot through my body, sharp and electrifying. Pain exploded through me, but there was no escape. The earth was taking me. And in that final, crushing moment, I understood. The creature, the force beneath the earth, it had never been imprisoned. It had been waiting. Waiting for me. For someone to disturb the seal. And now it was free. I was no longer a part of this world. My soul, my being, everything I was, became part of it, part of something far older, far darker than I could ever comprehend. The whispers, the voices, they stopped. And then everything went silent. And then nothing. Footprints in the snow. I've lived in Wyoming all my life. The harsh winters, the deep snow, the isolation, it's part of the landscape. But nothing could prepare me for what was happening out here now. Something strange. Something wrong. I first heard about the disappearances from one of the local farmers. He was the kind of man who didn't like to gossip, but when he spoke, you listened. His face was pale when he came into the diner, his hand shaking as he told me about his neighbor, Henry. Henry had gone out to check on his livestock in the morning, nothing unusual, but by the time the sun dipped low behind the mountains, there was no sign of him. Not a single trace, except for a line of footprints in the snow leading into the woods. The thing was, the prints stopped. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no blood, nothing to suggest that something violent had happened. Just the prints. Leading into nothing. That's when I started to worry. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared, but it was different this time. The others, sure, they could have wandered off, got lost, or worse, but Henry knew these woods. He knew the land. He wouldn't just vanish. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, especially as the snow kept falling, heavier and heavier. The whole place felt off. The air was thicker, colder. And the silence, it was unnatural. You couldn't even hear the wind, just the crunch of snow beneath your boots. I decided to go up there myself. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe it was just that nagging feeling, that sensation that something was drawing me in. Or maybe it was the growing panic that began to seep into everyone's conversations. People were starting to talk about things they didn't want to believe, things they were too afraid to name. So, I grabbed my coat, my boots, and set off into the gathering snow. The tracks were fresh. Henry's. And they led deep into the forest. At first, they were clear, perfect, almost too perfect. They were deep, as though he had walked with purpose. But the farther I went, the stranger it became. The tracks started to warp. The snow around them was disturbed, but there was no indication of where the prints were going. The snow seemed to twist, to fold unnaturally. The air grew colder still, and I could feel it in my bones. The kind of cold that wasn't just about the temperature. It was something else. Something suffocating. It felt as if the snow itself was watching me. The farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The tracks seemed to stretch and distort, as though they were fading, as though Henry had never been there at all. I kept telling myself to turn around, to head back to the warmth, but there was something pulling me forward. Something waiting. And then I found it. A large, flat rock, almost as if placed deliberately in the middle of the clearing. There, on the snow around it, were more tracks. But these weren't Henry's. These tracks, they were something else. Something larger. Something with claws. They led from the rock, moving off into the forest. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know why, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That I hadn't been alone for a while. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the trees behind me, but there was nothing. Only the howling wind and the endless white. And that's when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. I turned again, heart racing. The sound was faint, like someone was moving just out of sight, moving through the snow with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The crunch of each footstep was steady, constant. But when I tried to focus on the sound, it was gone. And that's when I realized the footprints weren't just fading in the snow. They were shifting. Moving slowly, as if being pulled away. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The snow, once pristine, was now darkening, like it was absorbing the tracks, swallowing them whole. I had to leave. My heart was in my throat as I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. A figure, far in the distance. Standing still, watching me. I blinked. It was gone. The snow was still falling, the landscape unchanged, but I knew what I had seen. Or rather, what I thought I had seen. The figure, it had been there. Or maybe not. Maybe I was losing my mind. But the feeling stayed. The feeling that I was being followed. That I wasn't alone. Not here in this frozen wasteland. Not anymore. I started to run. The crunch of snow under my boots was deafening now, every step echoing like a warning. And yet, every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing. No tracks. No figures. Just the snow. But as I neared the edge of the woods, I turned back one last time. And there, in the distance, the snow began to shift. Slowly, methodically. As if something beneath the surface was moving. something big, something alive. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't just behind me. They were all around me. The snow was no longer falling in quiet flakes. It was swirling, twisting, a violent wind now whipping through the trees. I had to get back. The wind howled as I stumbled out of the trees, my boots sinking deeper into the snow with each step. The sensation of being watched, the feeling of those unseen footsteps following me, it didn't leave. It clung to me, tightening around my chest like a vice. I didn't dare look back. If I did, I might see something I couldn't explain. Or worse, something that would never let me leave. The world around me had grown eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. The only sound was the relentless crunch of my boots against the snow as I hurried back toward the small cabin I had been staying in. The cold was becoming unbearable, but it wasn't the kind of cold you could attribute to just the weather. No, it was something deeper. Something colder than the temperature itself. I reached the cabin door and yanked it open, nearly tripping over the threshold as I stepped inside. The warmth of the fire didn't comfort me. It felt distant, as though the warmth couldn't quite reach me, trapped outside in the storm that had begun to gather strength once more. I slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut, my heart racing. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. No reason why I felt like I had been hunted, like I was being drawn into something that wasn't human. I stood there in the dim light of the cabin, listening to the wind howl outside. But it wasn't just the wind. It was the sound of something trying to reach me, clawing at the very walls of the cabin. The silence that followed was unsettling. The fire crackled softly, but the world outside seemed to press in, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The footprints, no, not just footprints. The way the snow had moved. How it had swallowed those tracks, pulling them in like they were never meant to be there. And the creature I had glimpsed, or thought I had glimpsed, just beyond the trees. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not here. Not in this cabin. Not in Wyoming anymore. I started pacing the small room, my breath coming in shallow bursts. There was no phone signal out here. No one for miles. I had only myself. The only thing I could rely on was my instincts. And my instincts told me that something was coming. Something I had disturbed by coming too close. I glanced toward the window, but the snowstorm outside had thickened, the white landscape now swallowed by an impenetrable wall of white. Through the haze, I thought I saw movement. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shadow darting just out of view, moving with a deliberate purpose. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't just the snow or the wind. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the natural world. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. I jumped, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was that the wind had caused something to break outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The noise had been too deliberate. Too loud. I grabbed the nearest flashlight and crept toward the door, my hands trembling. There was nothing but darkness outside. The world beyond the cabin was swallowed by the storm, but something about it felt wrong. Another thud. Then a scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. My breath caught in my throat. I was no longer alone. I slowly, carefully, moved toward the window. My pulse raced as I peered out into the swirling snow. The world was a blur of white, but there, in the distance, I saw something. A shadow moving in and out of the storm. It was large, hulking, and it wasn't human. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out of here. There was no way I could stay. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't going to stop until it found me. I rushed toward the door, but as my hand touched the handle, the door flew open with an overwhelming force. Snow and wind rushed in, but there was something else, something standing in the doorway. I couldn't make out its shape at first, but then it stepped forward. Its silhouette became clearer against the snowstorm, and I could see the deep shadow of its form. A creature, not human, but something far darker. It was tall, far too tall, and it had limbs that stretched impossibly long, moving in a way that wasn't natural. Its head was elongated, its face hidden beneath layers of shadow. But it had eyes, too bright, burning eyes that seemed to pierce through the snow, through the storm, and right into me. I stood frozen, unable to move. Its gaze locked onto mine, and the world around me seemed to fade away. There was no sound, no wind, no storm. Just those eyes. Then it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper, as though it had been trapped in the snow for centuries. "Come," it whispered. I couldn't understand. I couldn't move. But something inside me, deep down, knew exactly what it wanted. The snow, the storm, the creature itself, it was all connected. It was part of something older, something that had always been here, waiting for someone to uncover its presence. And I had uncovered it. The ground beneath me shook as the creature stepped forward, its long limbs reaching toward me. I had to leave. I had to escape. But the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, footsteps in the snow. Just outside. And I knew then that I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey. The darkness seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. The creature's presence filled the cabin, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me with its silence. My breath caught in my throat, sharp and shallow, as I backed away from the door. The eyes, glowing in the blackness, followed every move I made. Those eyes, there was something unnatural in them, something ancient. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it wasn't real, that I was just imagining things. The snowstorm outside had to be playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that I wasn't imagining it. That thing, whatever it was real. And it was here for me. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the temperature dropping by the second. It felt as if the very walls were closing in, the wood groaning under the weight of something heavy. The fire in the hearth, once warm and comforting, now seemed dim, struggling to push back the cold. But it wasn't just the cold of the storm. It was a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there waiting for it to come for me. My eyes darted around the cabin, desperately searching for something I could use, something that would give me a chance. But the only weapon within reach was an old rifle mounted on the wall. It had been there when I first arrived, a reminder of the wilderness surrounding us, but it felt useless now. Even if I managed to grab it, could I shoot something that I couldn't even comprehend? Another loud bang rattled the walls, this time from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness and the silence. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. And then it came again, the scraping sound, closer this time, moving from the door towards the back of the room. Closer and closer. The slow, methodical pace of whatever it was. A soft hiss followed, like the sound of a predator exhaling, preparing to strike. I took a deep breath, fighting the panic rising in my throat. There was no time left. I couldn't stay here. I bolted for the back door, my feet slipping on the snow-covered floor. I didn't care where I was going anymore, just anywhere but here. Anywhere but where it could reach me. My hand fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The cold, bitter wind outside howled as it battered against the door, pushing against me, urging me to leave. I yanked harder, finally forcing the door open. The wind tore at my coat, whipping the snow into my face, but I didn't stop. I ran into the night, the sound of the storm and my breath the only thing I could hear. Behind me, the snow was churning, twisting. The storm itself seemed alive, as though it were working against me. I stumbled, my legs growing heavy with exhaustion. The snow, now knee-deep, made every step feel like it was pulling me backward. I couldn't stop, couldn't rest. There was no place to hide. I could feel the thing behind me. It was there, somewhere in the storm, watching me, waiting for me to falter. Then, I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing still in the blizzard. Tall, skeletal, wrapped in shadows. The same eyes. Those burning eyes. I gasped, my heart thundering as I forced myself to keep running, but the snow was slowing me down. The wind howled louder, as if urging me to fall, to give in. The creature, or whatever it was drawing closer. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. I felt it in my lungs, the biting cold like knives. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it take me. Suddenly, there was a thud, a heavy, unnatural sound. Something crashing through the snow, pushing its way through the storm. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw it. The creature was moving faster now, its form towering above the snow. The wind seemed to bend around it, like the storm itself was its ally, helping it hunt. I had to make it to the truck. The truck wasn't far. Just beyond the ridge. If I could make it there, I could drive out. I could escape. But the snow was relentless. It pulled at me, gripped me in its icy fingers, slowing me, dragging me down with each step. The cold was like fire in my veins. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move fast enough. The creature was closer now, its form beginning to take shape through the snowstorm. The long limbs, the haunting eyes, everything about it screamed danger. But there was something else. Something more terrifying. The storm, it was moving with it. The snow was swirling in a circle, twisting into a funnel. It was no longer just a storm. It was a presence, an entity of its own. I could feel it closing in on me, consuming everything around me. The creature's shadow stretched across the snow, its hands reaching toward me, clawed fingers gleaming in the dim light. I screamed, but the wind swallowed the sound, pulling it from my lips as if it had never existed. The snow was up to my waist now. The truck was still 100 yards away, but the storm was pushing against me, dragging me down, keeping me from reaching it. I looked behind me, and the creature was there. Standing tall, its eyes locked on mine. I felt the ground shake beneath me, and the storm raged with a fury I had never felt before. The snow was now like a wall, a force I couldn't escape. And then, as if everything had been leading to this moment, the creature lunged. It moved faster than anything I had ever seen. Its hands reached out, grabbing me, pulling me into the storm. The cold enveloped me, pulling me deeper until I couldn't feel anything anymore. The last thing I saw were those eyes, burning with the fury of something ancient. Something older than the storm. Older than the land itself. And then everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, my breath ragged, heart pounding in my chest. My limbs were heavy, as if I had been dragged through the snow, and my head felt like it was spinning in circles. I tried to move, but my body felt numb, frozen to the core. The cold had seeped into my bones. I was lying on the ground, but this wasn't the snow-covered earth I had last seen. The ground beneath me was hard, rough stone. I pushed myself up, blinking, trying to focus, to make sense of where I was. The air was thin, suffocating, and the dim light around me flickered in strange ways, casting long, unnatural shadows. Where was I? I glanced around, my eyes slowly adjusting to the murky gloom. The walls were jagged, covered in frost and icicles, but not a single flake of snow. The air was still. No wind. No storm. No sound except for the ragged beat of my own heart. I wasn't outside anymore. This place was ancient. Dark. Hollow. The more I looked, the more I realized that I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched, the same gnawing sensation that had plagued me since I first felt the presence in the storm, it was here. This place, wherever it was not just empty. I turned my head, eyes darting in every direction. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, bending as though they were alive. I could hear the faintest whispers, words I couldn't understand, too distant to make out. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. The movement was slow, as if the very air was holding me back. Something was pressing against my chest, like a weight I couldn't shake. Then, I saw it. The creature, no, not just the creature, but a presence. A silhouette that loomed at the far end of the cavernous space. Its shape was shifting, flickering in and out of existence, like smoke curling through the air. It was tall, towering even. Its limbs stretched out impossibly long, and those eyes, those terrible eyes, burned through the darkness like twin flames. They were the same eyes I had seen in the storm. The same burning presence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was here. It had followed me. But how? How was I alive? A voice filled my mind, low, guttural, and ancient. You should not have come. I tried to speak, to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in a fog that seemed to swallow all sound. I stumbled backward, but the room stretched impossibly long, keeping the creature just out of reach. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth. Leave now, or be consumed. The words echoed in my mind, but they weren't just words, they were a command, a pull towards something I couldn't escape. I wanted to run, to fight, but my body refused to obey. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. The creature, no, the presence, was moving closer. The air grew thicker, colder. The shadows pressed in. I turned, desperate to find an exit, but the walls of the cavern seemed to shift with me, closing in, tightening their grip on me. There was no way out. No escape. You are the last. The voice reverberated inside my skull, making my teeth rattle. I gasped for air, but it was as though the very atmosphere was choking me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands gripping the icy stone. The shadows swirled around me, taking form, rising from the floor like mist, curling around my body, pulling me down into the darkness. I could feel their cold fingers, crawling over my skin, tugging at my limbs. You should never have come. The words rang in my ears as I was dragged further into the cold abyss. But then, as if by some miracle, I felt the ground shift. The weight of the shadows pressing against me loosened. The cold seemed to subside for just a moment, as if the creature, whatever it was, had paused. And in that brief moment, I heard something. A faint sound, almost inaudible beneath the oppressive silence. A crunch. A footstep. I wasn't alone. A new presence had entered the room. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the shadows. A figure, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I blinked, focusing through the dark, and my heart skipped a beat. It was a man, dressed in tattered winter clothing. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else, something knowing, as if he had been here before. "Help me." The words escaped my lips, but they were barely a whisper. I didn't know if he could hear me, if he even saw me. The man took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. And then he stopped, his gaze fixed on the creature, the presence that had been tormenting me. He didn't flinch. Didn't move. "You're not supposed to be here," the creature said. Its voice was low, like the growl of a storm. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his face emotionless, as though he were waiting for something. And then, something shifted. The shadows around us began to writhe, to twist. The air grew colder, if that was even possible, and the presence of the creature became almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, but I couldn't look away from the man. He was moving, stepping toward the creature. Slowly, calmly. And then, as if by some unspoken signal, he raised his hand. In an instant, the shadows pulled back, retreating into the corners of the room. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and he spoke, his voice sharp and clear. "You're not the first." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the world around me began to shift. The ground beneath me trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the presence of the creature. It was something else, something more powerful. The shadows, which had once coiled around me, were now retreating, pushed back by the strange figure in front of me. The air felt less oppressive, as if the storm that had been howling in my chest had finally subsided. The man, whoever he was, stood still, his eyes not leaving mine. His face was weathered, his hair wild from the harsh winds, but there was an unsettling calm in his expression. It was as if he had seen this place, this creature, countless times before. And in his eyes, I saw a flicker of recognition, of something deeper. He didn't speak, not immediately. He didn't need to. His presence alone told me more than words ever could. He knew exactly what was happening. He had been through this before. I wanted to ask him how, why, but the words caught in my throat. I was still trying to make sense of what had happened. How I had gone from the blizzard outside to this place of darkness. How I had somehow survived, when so many others had not. But before I could gather my thoughts, the creature, it shifted again. It hadn't gone. It had just retreated, waiting for the right moment. The eyes, those terrible, burning eyes, glowed from the edges of the shadows, watching us both. The man seemed unfazed. His gaze never faltered, even as the air grew heavier, colder. I could feel it again, the pressure in my chest, the sense that something was wrong, something ancient and far beyond my comprehension. "You shouldn't be here," the creature's voice echoed in my mind, a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. None of you should. The man raised his hand slowly, and with that small motion, the room seemed to shift again. The shadows deepened, but this time they did not advance. They hung back, almost as if the creature was waiting for something, waiting for us to act. I turned to the man, my throat dry. "Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flickered to the shadows, his jaw tightening. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in years. "I'm the one who came before you," he said. "And I won't be the last." His words sank into me like lead. I didn't understand. Came before me? Before I could ask more, the shadows behind him shifted once again, and the temperature dropped even further. The air felt like ice. It was hard to breathe, harder still to move. "It's too late for you," the creature hissed, its voice growing louder now, more desperate. "You will not escape. You never escape." My pulse quickened as the shadows pressed closer. I could feel the pressure of the darkness pushing against me, trying to squeeze the breath from my lungs. The man turned to face the creature. There was no fear in his eyes, only resignation. His lips parted, and in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, he spoke. "You're wrong." And with that, he took a step forward. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature faltered, its glowing eyes flickering. The shadows that had been closing in on me receded, if only for a brief second. I could feel the shift in the air, the change in the atmosphere, but it was fleeting. The man continued walking, slow and deliberate, each step filled with purpose. The creature snarled, the sound reverberating through the room. But the man was undeterred. "Every step you take here, you belong to it. But if you stop, you die." "It is only a matter of time," the creature rumbled, its voice growing angrier, more desperate. It was clear that it was afraid now, afraid of the man who was walking calmly toward it. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, stuck in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the man and the creature locked in this strange dance. The shadows seemed to pulse, a living thing, writhing and twisting around the man, but he didn't flinch. He reached out with his hand, just as the creature's eyes blazed brighter, and he spoke again, louder this time, his words echoing through the cavernous space. "You have no power here. Not anymore." A violent scream ripped through the air, but it wasn't the man's. It wasn't mine. The sound came from the creature itself, a high-pitched, wailing scream that rattled the very walls. The shadows writhed violently, twisting in on themselves as if they were burning from the inside out. And then, with a deafening crack, the room shook. The walls cracked and splintered, the stone beneath us groaning in protest. I could feel it, the pull of something greater, something beyond the creature's influence. It was like the very fabric of the room was coming apart. The shadows shrieked as they collapsed inward, consumed by a light that seemed to come from nowhere, flooding the room with a blinding brilliance. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The creature was gone. The room was no longer dark. The air was clear. The weight that had pressed on my chest lifted, and I could breathe again. I stumbled forward, dazed. I looked at the man, my voice barely a whisper. "What just happened?" He turned to me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. "You were meant to come here," he said quietly. "But you won't be the last. The storm, it's not over." I didn't understand. But I knew, deep down, that the storm, whatever it was far from finished. As I looked around the now empty room, I realized one thing: I had survived. But I hadn't escaped. The shadows would always be waiting. And somewhere out there in the snow, they would find me again. A day on the edge. It started with the hum of the crowd. The entire city seemed to be caught in the pulse of excitement. Chicago had always been a city of movement, of rhythm, but today it felt different. The streets were teeming with people, the air alive with a kind of energy that was impossible to ignore. The event, the one that had everyone talking for months, was finally here. A celebration of art, technology, and culture. It was supposed to be a day of marvels, of new ideas taking root. But beneath the surface of that excitement, something felt off. I was one of the millions participating, yet as I walked through the crowded streets, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The usual sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of sirens, seemed muted, distant, as though I was hearing them through a fog. It wasn't just the noise that felt strange, it was the air itself, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. The sun was high in the sky, yet the shadows it cast seemed sharper, deeper, as if they were trying to pull me into them. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. People were smiling, talking, taking pictures, their excitement tangible. But there was a strange sense of disconnection in the way they moved, as though they weren't entirely present, like I was surrounded by actors performing in a play, each person playing a part, but none of them aware of the reality around them. A couple passed me, laughing, their faces lit up with joy. I almost envied them. They seemed so at ease, so absorbed in the event. But as they walked past, I noticed something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The man was holding a phone, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were vacant, distant, as though he wasn't seeing what was right in front of him. The woman next to him noticed nothing. She smiled at him, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I turned to watch them as they disappeared into the crowd, but by the time I did, they were gone, swallowed by the mass of people. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. They had vanished. I paused, trying to collect my thoughts. Maybe it was the heat or the overwhelming noise, but that had felt wrong. Too wrong. I looked around again, half expecting to see something that would explain what I had just seen, but the crowd continued moving, oblivious to whatever it was that had unsettled me. I tried to shake it off. It had to be a trick of my mind, too much caffeine, maybe, or the stress of being surrounded by so many people in such a small space. I took a deep breath and started walking again, pushing through the crowd, trying to focus on the event, on the excitement that everyone else seemed to feel so strongly. But as I walked, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The deeper I went into the heart of the event, the more I felt like I was slipping into a dream. The atmosphere felt unreal, as if everything around me, the buildings, the people, the sky itself, was shifting, bending just beyond the edge of my perception. And then it happened again. A man, middle-aged, wearing a gray suit, was standing on the corner ahead of me, looking up at the large screen displaying the event schedule. He was motionless, staring at the screen, but his face, his eyes, were wide open, unblinking, fixed on nothing. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. It was as if he was frozen in time, a statue in the middle of the crowd. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse racing. I wasn't the only one who had noticed. People were walking around him, some giving him curious glances, others avoiding him as if he were a fixture in the landscape. But no one was stopping. No one was helping. No one seemed to care that the man was standing there, frozen in place. I glanced around, looking for someone else to confirm what I was seeing. But everyone else was too busy, too caught up in the event to notice the strange scene unfolding before me. I took a step closer to the man, my feet dragging against the pavement, my mind screaming for me to turn around, to walk away. But I couldn't move. I needed to know what was happening. As I approached, something in the air shifted. The hum of the crowd, the chatter, the music, all of it seemed to fade into a distant buzz. It was like the world was shrinking around me, closing in. The man's eyes, still wide open, turned slowly toward me, his gaze piercing, hollow, as if he could see straight through me. I froze. There was something about his expression that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't fear or confusion, it was something deeper, something that I couldn't understand, something that made my stomach twist. And then, without a word, he turned his head back to the screen, his body stiffening again, as if nothing had happened. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. What was going on? What was happening to this place? To me? The crowd continued moving, oblivious to the strange occurrences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer part of it. That somehow, I had stepped out of the world I knew, into something else. Something darker. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the feeling was gone. The crowd was just a crowd again. The music returned to its normal volume. The air no longer felt heavy. But the nagging sense of unease remained, lingering in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. It wasn't over. Something was happening, and it was only just beginning. I couldn't escape the feeling. The moment I had stepped away from the man and tried to move on, my mind was already spiraling. What was happening to me? Why was I suddenly so disconnected from everything? I couldn't shake the image of the man's empty gaze, the way the world around him seemed to ignore him, as if he was a part of the backdrop and not a person at all. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it was as though the very air I breathed was thick with tension. Each step I took felt like I was walking through a fog, the sounds of the city distorted, as if I was hearing everything from a far-off place. The skyscrapers loomed overhead, but they didn't feel like buildings anymore. They felt oppressive, looming over me with an unspoken weight. I tried to focus, to shake off the dizziness that had crept into my mind, but the more I tried to focus, the more I felt lost. I pulled out my phone, trying to distract myself with the familiar sight of the screen. Messages from friends, a few emails I needed to respond to, all the usual distractions. But even as I scrolled through them, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the surreal events I had witnessed. It was deeper than that. The phone felt foreign in my hands, the glow of the screen too bright against the dullness of the world around me. I decided to step inside a nearby coffee shop. The warm, inviting aroma of roasted beans should have been comforting, but the moment I entered, I felt that same sense of wrongness. The barista behind the counter smiled at me, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. Her gaze flickered, distant and unfocused, before she turned away to prepare my coffee. I moved to the counter, waiting. As I looked around the shop, I noticed the same vacant expressions in everyone else's eyes. A man in the corner booth stared into his cup of coffee, but he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed, unfocused. A woman sitting by the window absent-mindedly stirred her drink, her face expressionless. The conversation around me, a blend of murmurs and laughter, seemed to echo back at me in a way that felt hollow. "Here's your coffee," the barista said, her voice flat. She handed me the cup, but the warmth of it barely registered. I took it, mumbling a thanks, and walked to the corner of the room. I sat down, trying to breathe normally, trying to pull myself together. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had too much caffeine earlier. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. The sounds of the shop, the clink of spoons against cups, the soft shuffle of feet on the tiled floor, it all seemed too loud, too intrusive. It was as though the world was pressing in on me, overwhelming my senses. I put the cup down, my hands trembling slightly, and looked out the window. The streets outside were busy, the usual parade of people moving in all directions. But something caught my eye. A man standing on the opposite side of the street, staring at me. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his gaze locked onto me with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The world around him seemed to blur, the shapes of the buildings and the people walking past him melting into an indistinct haze. I turned my gaze back to the coffee shop. When I looked up again, the man was gone. Had I imagined him? Maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching. I stood up, leaving the coffee shop behind, my mind racing. The crowd outside felt more disorienting than before. Faces blurred as I passed, their features melting into each other. The usual chaos of the city was now a symphony of distortion. The sound seemed to echo strangely, as if bouncing off the walls of a canyon, growing louder and softer, never quite consistent. And the buildings, they loomed over me, too close now, pressing in from all sides. I walked faster, trying to break free from the claustrophobic grip of the city. I needed to get somewhere, anywhere, that felt normal again. As I turned a corner, I noticed the street ahead was strangely empty. There should have been people, there always were. But now, the road stretched before me, wide and silent, like an open wound. The only sound was the crunch of my footsteps against the pavement. The sun, which had been high and bright, now seemed to hang low in the sky, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched across the streets like fingers reaching out. I stopped. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. This wasn't the city I knew. This wasn't my reality. Something had changed. And I didn't know how much longer I could stay in this world before it swallowed me whole. I turned back to look behind me, and that's when I saw it. The man from the coffee shop. He was standing in the distance, watching me again, his face still unreadable. But now, there was no mistaking it. His eyes were not just locked onto me, they were pulling me in, drawing me toward him, as if some invisible force was urging me forward. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Every instinct told me to run, to get away from him, but I couldn't. I couldn't escape the feeling that he was somehow the key to this entire nightmare. I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. And then everything around me, everything, shifted. The shift was instantaneous, and yet I felt as if I had been falling for an eternity. One moment, I was standing on the street, staring at the man across the way, my feet rooted to the ground, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The next, I was somewhere else, somewhere completely unfamiliar. I couldn't breathe. The air felt wrong. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was sterile, as if I had been transported into a world where even the atmosphere had forgotten what it was supposed to feel like. I blinked, trying to make sense of the scene before me. I was still in the city, but it wasn't the same. The buildings were taller, looming above me with sharp, angular edges that seemed to reach into the sky like jagged teeth. The streets, usually bustling with activity, were eerily quiet. No people. no cars. Only a faint, distant hum, like the sound of machinery running far away. The sky above was dark, not the clear blue I had seen moments before. It was a dull gray, swirling with dark clouds that seemed to pulse, as if alive. The sun, if it was still the sun, was hidden behind that thick, suffocating sky, casting everything in a dim, unsettling light. It felt like I had stepped into a painting, a distorted reflection of the world I knew. I spun around, disoriented, trying to make sense of where I was. But everything was wrong. The buildings were not where they should have been. The streets curved in unnatural angles, and the city had an unsettling, empty feel, as if it had been abandoned long ago, left to rot in this strange, suspended moment. And then, I saw it, the man. He was still there, standing at the far end of the street, his expression unreadable, his gaze as piercing as ever. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes pulling me in like some kind of magnet. I had to get to him. I didn't know why, but it felt like he was the only thing in this place that was real. The rest of the world felt like a lie, a warped reflection of the city I knew. I began to walk toward him, each step heavier than the last, the ground beneath my feet seeming to resist my movements. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally in the quiet, like the beat of a drum in an empty hall. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. I didn't want to look behind me. I didn't want to see what might be following, what might be lurking in the shadows of this twisted version of the city. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something just out of sight, watching me, waiting for the moment to pounce. As I moved closer to the man, my surroundings began to shift again. The buildings seemed to warp, bending like paper in the wind. The sky above flickered, as though it were a broken screen trying to display an image it couldn't quite process. I reached out to touch the man's shoulder, hoping that somehow, by touching him, I could anchor myself back into reality. But just as my hand was about to make contact, the world around us began to crumble. The ground shook beneath my feet, sending ripples of distortion through the air. The man's face remained unchanged, his eyes locked on mine as the world around him twisted and tore apart. I couldn't think. My breath caught in my throat. The entire city seemed to be collapsing, breaking into shards of glass, fragments of reality scattering like broken mirrors. And then, everything went black. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if time itself had stopped. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Everything was hazy, like waking up from a nightmare, the edges of the world too blurry to make sense of. I was lying on the ground now. The pavement beneath me felt solid, but the sky above was still a dark, oppressive gray. There was no sound, no movement, no life. The city, once full of energy and noise, was now nothing but a hollow shell, abandoned and forgotten. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. I could barely move. My mind was foggy, struggling to process what had just happened. The man was gone. And yet, I felt his presence still. I stood shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me. My surroundings hadn't changed, but something had. Something about the air felt even more stifling now, as if it was closing in around me, making it harder to breathe. I reached for my phone again, hoping for some kind of normalcy, some connection to the world I once knew. But the screen was cracked. The familiar notifications, the reassuring messages from friends, they were all gone. In their place was only static, a white noise of random letters and numbers flickering across the screen. My heart began to race again, the fear rising in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this place. I needed to find a way out. I began walking again, my steps unsure but determined. I didn't know where I was going or what I was hoping to find. All I knew was that I couldn't stay still, not with the suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. And then I heard it. A soft rustle. A movement in the distance. I stopped dead in my tracks, every muscle in my body tensing. I looked around, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from, but everything was still. There was no one. Nothing. Except for the footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but they were there. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. The footsteps were getting closer. Slowly, methodically, they echoed through the silent streets, as if whoever was walking was taking their time, savoring each step. I froze, heart pounding, my breath shallow in my chest. There was no one in sight, but I could feel the presence of something, someone, just beyond my vision. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if the ground beneath me had turned to stone, locking me in place. I strained my eyes, scanning the street for any sign of life, but there was nothing. Just the hollow emptiness of the city, the oppressive silence that seemed to smother every sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. A figure appeared at the far end of the street, emerging from the thick, gray mist that hung in the air like a living thing. At first, it was just a shape, dark, indistinct, shrouded in shadows. But as it drew nearer, I could make out the details. A person, tall, draped in a long, dark coat, their face obscured by a hood. I felt my heart race even faster. It wasn't the figure itself that terrified me, it was the way it moved. There was no hurry, no rush. The figure walked with a slow, deliberate pace, as though it knew I would be watching, as though it knew exactly when I would see it. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted in the other direction. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was as if some unseen force was holding me there, forcing me to watch. The figure stopped, just at the edge of the mist, and for a moment, everything was still. The air felt heavier now, as if the very atmosphere had thickened, become something tangible, something that could be touched. My chest tightened, and I found it hard to breathe. My eyes were glued to the figure, unable to look away. And then, it moved again. It stepped forward, one slow, measured step at a time, its movements deliberate, purposeful. I could see the edges of the coat flutter slightly, but there was no wind, no breeze to explain it. The figure was a ghost, a shadow cast in a world that didn't make sense. My thoughts raced, spinning wildly, but none of them made sense. Was it real? Was this some sort of hallucination? Was I still dreaming? Or had I somehow crossed into another reality, one where rules didn't apply, where the normal laws of physics no longer held sway? The figure took another step, and I felt the ground beneath my feet tremble. A low hum, almost imperceptible, began to vibrate through the air, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. My skin prickled with unease. The figure was close now, close enough that I could almost make out the details of its face, though the hood still obscured it. And then, without warning, it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sliced through the thick air like a knife. "You've been waiting for me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I took an instinctive step back, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what to say. But I was sure of one thing now, I wasn't alone in this place. There was something here with me. Something that had been here all along, waiting, watching. I don't know what you mean, I said, the words stumbling out of my mouth, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stood there, its head still hiding its face, its presence as overwhelming as the city itself. You are not supposed to be here, it said. The voice was calm, almost disinterested, as if it was speaking to someone it had spoken to many times before. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. What was this? Who was this? And why did it feel like everything around me, the city, the streets, even the air itself, was closing in, drawing tighter, more suffocating with each passing second? You don't belong, the figure repeated. Its voice was colder now, sharper, cutting through the air like ice. And that's why I realized it, the truth I had been avoiding, the truth that had been hiding just beneath the surface all along. The city was wrong. The world I had known was slipping away, fading into the distance, leaving behind only this twisted, distorted version. This place was not real. None of it was real. I had crossed over. I had stepped into a world that wasn't mine. But how? Why? How had I gotten here? Before I could form another thought, the figure stepped forward, its face now visible beneath the hood. And I gasped. It was me. But it wasn't. The face that stared back at me was a distorted reflection of my own, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. It was like looking into a broken mirror, the edges fractured and shattered, the eyes empty, hollow. I took another step back, my breath catching in my throat, the realization crashing into me like a wave. This wasn't just some person, some stranger I had stumbled upon. This was me. A version of me that had somehow crossed into this world, this twisted, nightmarish version of reality. The figure raised a hand, and I flinched, expecting it to reach for me, to drag me further into the void that was closing in around us. But it didn't. It just pointed, slowly, deliberately, toward the horizon where the sky pulsed with an unnatural light. You need to leave. Now. I didn't know how to respond. The figure, myself, or what had once been myself, pointed toward the horizon where the sky had taken on an eerie, unnatural glow. The city seemed to hum with a strange energy, the air vibrating, thick with the tension of something about to break. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sense of dread. The figure's finger hovered in the air, unmoving. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were black holes, sucking in all the light around them. The voice, now hollow and distant, echoed in my ears. Do you understand? You're not meant to be here. The words felt like a warning. A sentence. But what did it mean? I had no answers. I had no idea how to get out of here, how to return to my reality, the world I knew. I glanced back toward the city, toward the buildings that had once felt so familiar, but now they loomed like shadows, distorted, their edges blurring and shifting. I didn't recognize them anymore. There was no warmth, no comfort in this place. Only coldness. Only isolation. The hum in the air grew louder, the sound of something beyond comprehension, vibrating through the earth itself, making my teeth ache. I could feel my chest tightening with every passing second, the weight of the world pressing in on me, bending the very fabric of reality. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I had never asked for this. I had never wanted to be caught in this strange, altered version of my life. But now I was too late to go back. I had crossed a line, and I didn't know how to undo what I had done. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. How do I leave? My voice was barely a whisper, the words feeling insignificant in the face of everything that was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control, that the ground beneath me was slipping away. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it turned its head toward the glowing horizon, where the sky now pulsed with light in rhythmic waves, like a beating heart. You can't. Not unless you face it. The words sent a chill through me, and I felt the ground beneath my feet tremble again. There was something more to this. Something deeper. The figure, me, wasn't just warning me. It was telling me the truth, the horrible, terrifying truth. This world, this reality, it wasn't just altered. It had been destroyed. And I was stuck in the ruins, trapped in the remnants of something that had once been real. You've seen it, haven't you? The figure's voice was softer now, almost sympathetic. The cracks, the breaks. The world falling apart piece by piece. You felt it. It stepped closer, its form becoming more solid, more tangible. And now, you're part of it. Just like the rest of us. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But there was no place to run to, no escape from the crushing reality that was closing in on me. This was it. This was the truth I had to face. The world was collapsing, and I was part of the ruin. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against mine, and for a moment, I felt a wave of cold, sharp as ice, pour through me. It wasn't a physical cold. It was something deeper, something that touched the very core of who I was. And then, the figure was gone. Vanished into the mist, leaving me standing alone in the center of a city that was no longer a city at all. I looked around, dazed, struggling to process what had just happened. The streets were empty now, the noise of the city, its cars, its people, its life, gone, swallowed by the void. Only the faint, flickering light from the sky remained. But there was something more now. Something wrong. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, echoing through the silent streets. I looked around, but there was no one there. Not yet. But they were coming. I could feel it. The ground was trembling again, as if the city itself was waking up, shaking off the remnants of its previous self. I had no time. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I turned, desperate, and started to run. My feet pounded against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself forward, away from the strange reality that was swallowing me whole. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. This city was closing in, and there was no place left to hide. The footsteps grew louder, faster, until I couldn't tell if they were mine or someone else's. I reached a corner, my heart pounding in my chest, and stopped. A figure stood at the end of the street. It was me again. But this time, there was no mistaking it. This was not a reflection, not a version of myself from another world. It was me, my true self, or at least what was left of it. I could see the blankness in my own eyes, the hollowness that mirrored everything I had seen in this twisted city. And then, the world around me shifted. The sky pulsed once more, and the ground beneath me gave way. And with that, the city, the world, fell apart completely. The abandoned villa. I had always heard the stories about the villa on the outskirts of town. Old, forgotten, shrouded in mystery, Its decaying walls whispered of a past that no one wanted to remember. But there was something about it that called to me. Something beyond the rumors, beyond the warnings. A fascination that I couldn't quite explain. They said the villa had been abandoned for decades. Yet, despite its apparent emptiness, there was something unsettling about it. It never seemed truly abandoned. The windows always appeared clean, as if someone had polished them recently, though no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave the place. The garden, though overgrown, never seemed to fully overrun with weeds. It was as if it existed in a state of suspended animation, neither truly alive nor dead. I remember the first time I went there. It wasn't planned. I was driving through the area, the sky clouded over with the promise of rain, when I saw the villa standing in the distance, its silhouette looming against the gray sky. There was no one else around. The road was eerily quiet, and I found myself drawn toward it. I parked my car at the edge of the property, a good distance from the house. As I stepped out, the air felt dense, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I could almost hear a faint hum in the air, like the low murmur of a conversation just beyond hearing. It was the silence that struck me first. Nothing moved. No birds, no animals, no rustling leaves. The villa, though dilapidated in appearance, felt alive. There was something wrong with it, but I couldn't tell what. I stood there for a while, staring at the house, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The sun, struggling to break through the clouds, cast strange shadows across the walls, giving them an almost real quality despite their decay. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. The faintest creak. Like a door opening, but no wind was blowing. No one was there. Curiosity won out. I walked toward the house, my footsteps echoing louder than I had expected on the gravel path. My heart beat faster with each step, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see it up close. I needed to understand. The front door was ajar, just slightly. I hesitated before pushing it open, the hinges groaning in protest as I stepped into the shadow of the house. Inside, the air was cool and thick, and the scent of dust and mildew filled my nostrils. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, their edges curling as if trying to escape the confines of the house. The furniture, draped in white sheets, sat untouched, as if waiting for someone to return. A few old portraits hung crookedly on the walls, their eyes staring down at me with vacant, hollow gazes. I swallowed hard, stepping further into the darkened hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the faint sound of something, or someone, moving echoed just beyond my perception. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. What was that? For a moment, I thought I saw something move at the far end of the hallway. A shadow, maybe? Or just my mind playing tricks on me? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached out, gripping the banister as I slowly ascended the staircase. The wood was cold to the touch, as though it had been abandoned for far longer than I had been told. As I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent, but somehow alive. That's when I noticed something strange. The portraits on the walls, ones I had seen downstairs, were no longer the same. The faces had changed. The eyes, once empty, now seemed to follow me as I moved. My heart raced. There was no rational explanation for it, but something deep inside me knew the truth. This house was not simply abandoned. It was waiting for something. Or someone. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and never look back. But something kept me there. The air felt thick, almost like a presence was pressing in on me from all sides. And then I heard it again. A sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft, slow footstep. Followed by another. And another. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were getting closer, each one a heavy thud that seemed to reverberate through the house, as if the very walls were alive with the sound. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The oppressive silence around me seemed to press harder, amplifying the sound of the approaching steps. They weren't just echoing in the hall, they were coming from behind me. I slowly turned my head, eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit hallway, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and faded wallpaper peeling off the walls like dead skin. I forced myself to move. One step forward, then another. I had to get out. There was something here, something waiting for me. My skin prickled with a cold sweat as I stepped backward, my eyes still scanning the dark corners of the house for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a low creak echoed through the stillness, coming from upstairs. My eyes shot up to the second floor, where I saw nothing but the distant outline of the closed door at the end of the hallway. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. The footsteps were now louder, coming from above me, as though someone, or something, was slowly descending the stairs. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wooden floor as I bolted down the stairs. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the front door, but the door was no longer ajar. It was shut tight. I tugged desperately at the handle, panic flooding my mind. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. I turned back to the house, but the hallway stretched before me like an endless tunnel, shadows creeping up the walls. I could still hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, getting closer, but they were no longer coming from above. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. A tall, dark shape, shrouded in shadows, just standing there, watching me. Then it moved. A shiver ran down my spine as the figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The eyes that stared down at me were hollow, empty, but somehow, I could feel them. They were watching me, studying me. The air grew colder, and the floor beneath me seemed to groan with each step the figure took. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, then went black. I dropped it, a sense of dread sinking into my chest. This place, this house, it wasn't like any abandoned building I had ever been in. It was alive, in a way. The walls, the floors, the very air, it felt like it was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like furniture being overturned, something heavy being thrown across the room. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard. Whatever was in this house, it wasn't alone. I turned and slammed my shoulder into the door again, but it refused to open. Panic gripped me, my mind racing for a way out. I needed to leave. Now. I turned back to the hallway, determined to find another exit. The figure was closer now, standing at the bottom of the stairs, its shape dark and distorted. Its head tilted to the side, as if examining me, studying my every move. This isn't real, I thought, my mind desperately clinging to the notion. This isn't real. I just need to wake up. This is a dream. But the figure stepped forward, its movement unnatural, as though the bones in its body didn't bend the way they should. I could feel the room growing colder, the silence now replaced by a low, humming sound like an engine that was just starting up. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the house itself was breathing. I couldn't keep it together much longer. The figure was now only a few feet away from me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time since I entered the house, I felt the true weight of fear. Not the terror of the unknown, but the terror of knowing something was coming for me, something that had been waiting, just out of reach, for so long. Suddenly, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the floor as I turned and bolted for the door. The air around me seemed to crackle with an unnatural force, and the very walls seemed to close in. I had to get out. The door had to open. With one last, desperate shove, I slammed into the door once more, and it opened. I didn't look back. I ran. The villa loomed behind me, its windows now staring at me like eyes, watching, waiting for me to return. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and a cold, bone-chilling wind whipped around me as I fled down the driveway. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life as I drove away, the villa fading into the distance. But even as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had not let me go. That it was still watching, waiting for the next time I would come back. As I drove through the darkened streets, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The house, the figure, everything that had happened felt like a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the icy grip of that presence, still hear the creaking of the house as it seemed to groan in its dark slumber, as though it was alive. I tried to rationalize everything. I told myself I was just tired. That maybe the house had played tricks on my mind, that my fear had distorted everything into something far worse than it had been. But even as I told myself this, I knew deep down that I wasn't being truthful. There was something about that place that didn't belong in this world. It wasn't just old or abandoned, it was cursed, or worse. Alive in a way I couldn't begin to explain. The streets outside seemed empty, as if the world had gone still. A fog began to roll in from the horizon, thicker than any fog I had ever seen, creeping over the pavement like a living thing. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my breath shallow. The headlights of my car illuminated the road ahead, but they didn't reach far enough to cut through the heavy mist. It felt wrong, like the fog itself was swallowing the night. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I jumped, the sound jarring in the silence. My heart raced as I picked it up. The screen flickered before lighting up. A message. It was from an unknown number. You didn't leave. You're still here. I froze. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, behind me. The empty road stretched out into the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly tapped out a reply, my fingers trembling as I typed. Who is this? No response. I let out a shaky breath and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, trying to push the panic back. The sound of my heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then, the fog thickened even more, swirling around the car in tendrils of white mist, obscuring my vision. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop fast enough. The tires screeched as they slid over the slick road, and I fought to regain control of the vehicle. The fog, it wasn't normal. It was thickening, moving in on me, not just blocking my sight, but slowly closing in on my car like a living creature, suffocating everything in its path. I stepped on the gas, but the fog only thickened, pressing against the windshield as though trying to crawl inside. Panic surged through me. My pulse quickened, each breath more difficult than the last. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, just beyond the edge of the road, standing still in the mist. I could only make out the outline of it, but it was unmistakable, tall, dark, and watching. The figure. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, frozen, waiting. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My mind raced. How could it be here? I had left the villa, the cursed place, miles behind me. But this thing was somehow following me. I didn't know how, but it was. I slammed on the gas, trying to outrun it. The figure remained there in the mist, never moving, always watching. But then, something else happened. The car sputtered and jerked, as if the engine was faltering. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator harder, but the car slowed, refusing to go any faster. And then I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The car was no longer responding to my commands. It was as if the very road had turned against me, forcing me toward the fog, toward the figure. It was all wrong. I fought to turn the wheel, but it was useless. The car slid forward, the fog pressing closer, swallowing the road, swallowing everything. The figure, now unmistakable in its features, moved toward me, a slow and deliberate pace that seemed to go on forever. I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. In that moment, I understood the truth about the villa. It wasn't just a haunted house. It wasn't just a place that had somehow trapped the souls of the past. It had followed me. And now, it was coming for me. The car lurched to a stop, and the world went completely dark. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, growing louder and louder until they consumed everything. Then there was silence. And I realized I had never left the villa at all. The darkness enveloped me completely, and for a moment I thought I might be dreaming. But there was no comfort in the void, no escape from the suffocating sense of dread. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled to catch my breath, my mind racing with the impossible thoughts of what had just happened. Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of my mind? But then, I felt it. A cold breeze, sharp as ice, whispered through the car, brushing against my skin like a hand. I jerked upright, eyes darting to the fog that had now completely overtaken the vehicle. I reached for the door, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic swelled within me as I pulled harder, my fingers numb, but the door remained sealed tight. Then, I heard it again. A soft sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from outside the car. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but it was no use. The footsteps were getting closer, unmistakably coming toward me, each step a death knell echoing in the stillness. I was trapped. I tried to tell myself that there was some logical explanation. Maybe the fog had made me disoriented. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe there was a rational reason for everything that had happened, something I could understand. But as the footsteps grew louder and I felt the presence draw nearer, my rational mind shattered. There was no explanation for this. I pressed myself against the seat, my body trembling uncontrollably. The mist outside seemed to thicken even more, swallowing everything, closing in on me. The cold seeped through the glass, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The footsteps stopped. The silence was unbearable. My pulse raced in my ears, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something, to act, to escape. And then, the window beside me creaked. Slowly, as if something was pushing against it from the outside, testing it. A thin crack of light appeared, a sliver of the outside world slipping in. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. The window hadn't been open. I hadn't touched it. But someone, was on the other side. I turned my head slowly, eyes wide, too afraid to look but too terrified not to. And then I saw it. The figure, standing just outside the car, its features twisted, darkened by the fog. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out its face, but the way it watched me, the way it knew I was there, it was suffocating, all-consuming. It raised one hand, slow and deliberate, and I saw it, fingers long and unnaturally thin, reaching toward the window. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then it touched the glass. The moment its fingers made contact, the temperature inside the car plummeted. The glass began to frost over, the edges of the mist creeping in through the cracks. My chest tightened as I watched the frost spread across the window, forming shapes, swirling like a storm. Shapes that almost looked like faces. I gasped. They were there, staring at me through the frozen mist. Faces I didn't recognize, twisted, distorted, contorted in pain and horror. They pressed against the window, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes filled with nothing but despair. They weren't just ghosts. They were the remnants of something much older, much darker. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure outside didn't move, it simply stood there, its hand still pressed to the window, the frost continuing to spread. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of it, the feeling that the presence outside was pulling something from within me, something deep and primal, draining me of all hope. I knew what it was. It was the house. The villa. It had followed me here, in the fog, in the darkness. It had never let go. The spirits of that place were inside me now, and they were taking everything. The faces in the frost weren't just memories. They were the last vestiges of the souls trapped within that place, the ones who had never left, never escaped. I pounded on the steering wheel, my hands slick with sweat, the fog pressing in from every direction. But there was no escape. The figure outside began to move again, slowly, its face now inches from mine through the frozen window. Its eyes burned into mine, and I felt a pull deep within my chest, as if the figure were drawing my soul out of my body. The frost on the glass began to crack, the cold seeping in through the broken shards. I was shaking uncontrollably now, my whole body tense, unable to move, unable to think, as the figure's hand moved to the door handle. It wasn't a figure anymore. It was the house itself, the spirits of the past, taking me with them, pulling me into the same never-ending nightmare they had suffered. I could feel their cold, empty hands on me, their hollow breath on my neck. I was no longer alone. The last thing I felt was the door opening. Then everything went black. I awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as if I had been submerged in cold water. The darkness around me was thick, oppressive. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, sluggish. I blinked several times, forcing my mind to focus, to make sense of what was happening. The cold, the fog, the figure, it was all gone. The car was still, the air still, but I wasn't in the car anymore. I was in a room. The walls were smooth, and the air smelled faintly of decay. The faintest light leaked in through a narrow crack in the wall, just enough to cast long, unsettling shadows across the floor. I shivered, instinctively reaching out for something, anything to steady myself. My hands touched cold stone, slick with moisture. A chill ran up my spine. Where am I? I pushed myself up, forcing my muscles to work. The floor was rough beneath my palms, and the cold seeped into my skin like ice. My head spun, and I had to lean against the wall for a moment, trying to gather my bearings. There was no sound here. No wind, no whisper of fog, no footsteps. The stillness was deafening. I looked around, but the light was so faint it barely illuminated anything. The shadows seemed to stretch forever, making it impossible to get a sense of the space I was in. Panic began to rise in my chest again, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to let it overtake me. I had to focus. What happened? I had been driving, hadn't I? The fog, the figure outside the car. The cold, God, the cold that had made my skin feel like it was being pierced by needles. Then, nothing. A black void. I reached for my phone in my pocket, but it wasn't there. The familiar weight was gone. I was alone, and I had no idea how I'd gotten here or why. I took a deep breath, my chest tight as I looked around again. There was no exit, no door. Just cold stone and shadow. Was this some kind of nightmare? But no. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt too real, too heavy, too suffocating. A sound broke through the silence, making me freeze in place. A low groan, like the creaking of wood. It came from somewhere deeper within the darkness. My eyes strained to catch any movement, but there was nothing. Just more shadows. I should run. I should move, do anything to get out of here. But my legs refused to cooperate. I stood frozen, every fiber of my being screaming at me to get out, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. What was that? The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable, a creak of something heavy shifting in the dark. It was coming closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill slide down my spine. Something, or someone, was in here with me. The creaking stopped. A soft scuffing sound followed. Slow, deliberate. Closer. Then, a voice. It was so faint, I almost didn't hear it, but when it came, it was a whisper that sent a chill down my spine. Don't leave. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding in my chest. The voice was soft, yet unmistakably clear. I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was here with me, and it was telling me not to leave. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, more suffocating, as the temperature dropped even lower. My breath misted in front of me, thick and white, and the shadows felt alive. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The voice came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent, and closer. Stay with us. Forever. I could feel it now, the presence moving through the darkness, inching closer, creeping up on me. The air around me thickened, pressing against me like a weight. The walls seemed to close in, and I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me. I needed to get out. I had to. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong. The shadows shifted, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. A figure. Tall, gaunt, and twisted. It was standing still, watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of it. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its face hidden in the shadows. I took a step forward, hesitated, then moved again, my body trembling as I searched for an escape. But it was futile. There was no door. No windows. No way out. Stay with us. The voice was louder now, all around me. I could feel the pressure of the words in my mind, pressing against my skull. You belong here. I turned quickly, my mind racing. I had to find a way out. But then, everything changed. The walls around me cracked, the floor shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw the outline of a door, a sliver of light breaking through the darkness. I lunged for it, desperate, reaching out with shaking hands. And just before I reached the light, the floor beneath me gave way. The last thing I heard was the voice, soft, cold, and final, whispering, "It's too late." And then, there was nothing but darkness. Empty night. The air was still, an unusual calm stretching over the outskirts of Boston. It was the kind of stillness that weighed heavily on the chest, like the world itself was holding its breath. My name is Eric, and I live in one of the more secluded areas of the city, a neighborhood that has always felt separate from the bustle of downtown. Tonight, however, something felt wrong. It wasn't the usual quiet I had grown accustomed to. The streetlights, usually faintly flickering in the distance, seemed to dim ever so slightly, and the houses on the block appeared to be further away. I stood on my porch, staring at the empty street before me, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my thoughts. There was no sign of life, no cars, no voices, no movement. But it wasn't just the absence of people that bothered me. It was the emptiness that seemed to extend deeper than the street, creeping into the very fabric of the place. I couldn't quite place it, but the longer I looked, the more the buildings around me seemed like illusions. Ghosts of homes, their outlines flickering in and out of existence, like I was looking through an old, faulty lens. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, but I could hear the sound growing more distorted, like a warped version of reality. Was this my mind playing tricks, or was there something else? A faint rustle came from the window, but when I looked out, the street was as empty as before. Still, the sensation lingered, the deep, gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. I turned on the television, hoping to distract myself, but even the screen seemed off. The news anchor's voice was muffled, the words distorted, like the air itself had become thick and hard to breathe. The usual stories were there, weather, traffic, the usual updates, but nothing felt real. Something was happening. Something beyond simple fear. Then the ground trembled. At first, it was barely perceptible, a shiver in the floorboards that made my legs wobble. I grabbed the edge of the couch to steady myself. It lasted only a moment, but the strange vibration filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls around me seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was trying to inhale, to breathe with me, and it was suffocating. Outside, the street was still empty, but I thought I saw something, a shadow, a silhouette at the far end of the road, where the streetlight should have been. It was fleeting, just a flicker. I wasn't sure if it had been real. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Was I tired, disoriented? The longer I sat there, the more the world felt alien, unfamiliar, like a dream I couldn't escape. And yet, the feeling of something watching me, something waiting just beyond the threshold of my understanding, grew stronger. It wasn't just the neighborhood that was off. It was everything. Every street, every corner of the city felt wrong. It was as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel, piece by piece. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, trying to shake off the growing panic. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but it did little to clear my mind. The streets, the houses, everything seemed to fade into the background as I walked deeper into the night. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, all of it had vanished, replaced by a silence that pressed down on my ears. It didn't take long before I realized something else. There were no stars in the sky. Just an endless expanse of black, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Even the moon, which should have been visible, had disappeared, swallowed up by the same nothingness that was overtaking the city. As I walked farther, I felt a sensation growing stronger, the sense that the world around me was dissolving. The houses, the buildings, even the street beneath my feet seemed to fade into a thin mist, like vapor rising from the ground. But I wasn't cold. There was no chill to the air. The world wasn't disappearing, it was being erased. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. How could this be happening? How could a whole city, a whole reality, start to vanish like this? And then I heard it. A soft hum, like the beginning of a low, persistent growl vibrating through the ground beneath me. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew louder, more pronounced. The sound of something big, something massive, pulling the city apart. I couldn't move. The ground beneath my feet began to shift and buckle, and I realized with a shock that the buildings were no longer solid. They had become translucent, as if they were fading from view, sliding away like shadows in the dark. I turned to run, but it was no use. The world was slipping away, piece by piece. I could feel it. Every step I took, the ground seemed less certain, less real. And then, as if in response to my fear, the world around me gave way. In the distance, the faint outline of my street, of my home, disappeared completely, replaced by a vast, empty expanse. There was no more city. No more Boston. Only the void. Suddenly, everything went silent. There was nothing left to hold on to. I wasn't sure how long I had been standing there, frozen in that endless black space, but the terror of it all was starting to sink in. I had been abandoned, not just by the world, but by reality itself. Then, in the blackness, I heard a voice. A whisper. "Welcome to the emptiness." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then I realized the city, the people, the streets, they were never real. It had all been a dream, a fleeting illusion, and I had been part of it all along. But now, I was left in the nothingness. Alone. I stood there, breathless, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The world around me felt wrong, twisted, like a nightmare I couldn't escape. My mind was struggling to comprehend what I was experiencing, but everything I knew about the world seemed to be falling apart. The black void stretched endlessly in all directions, and I was left alone with only the faint echo of that whisper in my ears. "Welcome to the emptiness." The words rang in my head, and I wondered if they were meant for me, or if they were the last remnants of something far older, far more sinister than I could ever understand. I was numb, unable to feel anything beyond the overwhelming emptiness that surrounded me. My thoughts felt disconnected, like I was no longer truly in my own body. Was this the end? Was I dead, lost in some dark dimension beyond reality? I took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath me strangely soft, as though it weren't quite real. My feet sunk slightly, leaving no trace behind. I looked around, desperate to find anything familiar, but there was nothing. The space around me was infinite, no walls, no buildings, no signs of life. It was as if the entire world had been erased, wiped away by some unseen hand. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The world I had known, my home, the streets, the familiar faces of people I passed by every day, had disappeared, leaving only this oppressive silence. How had I gotten here? Was this the end of the world, or had the world simply stopped existing? My mind raced, but no answers came. I could hear my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to focus, to pull myself back from the brink of madness. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way back to the real world, to the life I had left behind. But as I took another step forward, I noticed something strange. The edges of my vision were blurring, like the very air was shifting and warping. The emptiness around me began to feel alive. It was as though the void itself was aware of my presence, watching me with an unseen, malevolent gaze. Suddenly, there was a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible flash of light in the distance. It was just a moment, but it felt like a lifeline. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I had to move toward it. It was the only thing that had given me any sense of direction in this endless, suffocating blackness. I began walking toward the light, my footsteps unsteady, unsure of where I was heading. Each step felt like I was walking through thick air, as though the very fabric of reality was growing denser, pulling me back with every movement. The flicker of light grew brighter, and with it, the sound of something strange. It wasn't a voice, but something deeper, more primal. A hum, almost imperceptible at first, but slowly becoming louder, vibrating through my body like an electric current. It was coming from the light, and as I drew closer, I could see shapes forming in the glow. Shapes, or shadows. Figures. The light shifted, revealing silhouettes, indistinct and shifting in a way that made my skin crawl. They weren't human, not entirely, but they seemed to be watching me, observing my every move. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them clearly. The hum intensified, and the shadows began to move. The air felt thick with tension, and I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows, no, they weren't just shadows anymore, were forming into something solid, something tangible. They were coming toward me. I tried to step back, but the space around me seemed to close in. The edges of my vision darkened, and I felt a weight pressing down on me, as if the void itself was swallowing me whole. Then, in the distance, I saw it. The outline of something I recognized. The street I had left behind. The houses, the trees, the familiar sidewalk, everything I had thought was gone. It was all there, but it was distorted, twisted. The buildings seemed to bend and warp, as though the very structure of the world was being torn apart. I ran. I didn't know where I was running to, but I had to get away from the shifting shadows, from the overwhelming hum that seemed to rattle my bones. The ground beneath me began to tremble again, this time more violently, and the air thickened, making it hard to breathe. "You can't escape," the voice echoed again, not from any one direction, but from everywhere. It was as though the very void was speaking to me, taunting me, telling me that I was trapped here, forever. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, but there was none. The silence, that suffocating silence, pressed in on me from all sides. I was choking on it. I couldn't see. I couldn't think. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was gone, or if I ever truly left. When I opened my eyes again, the world was still empty. The hum had stopped. The shadows had gone. The light had faded. But the emptiness remained. It was all that was left. I reached out, trying to touch something, anything, but my hand passed through the nothingness. There was nothing to hold on to. I was alone. And I always had been. And that was when I understood. The world had never really been real. It had only been a lie. I stood there in the crushing void, and with the realization came a strange, numb acceptance. There was no escape. No return. My mind had already started to fragment, pieces of my former life slipping away as if they were nothing more than fog, dissipating under the weight of this unnatural silence. Was I dead? Was this some sort of limbo? But then, I remembered something. The last thing I heard, the voice. The echo that had followed me, haunting me like a shadow. It was a memory now, distant and unreachable, but it still lingered at the back of my mind, like a faint pulse that refused to die. It had said something, you can't escape. It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement of fact. A truth. I felt an odd compulsion to move. As if the emptiness was beckoning me, daring me to walk deeper into it. To accept it. But I resisted. I didn't want to give in. Not yet. I began walking aimlessly, unsure of where I was going, but still trying to force my body to obey. My legs moved, one step after another, each step as heavy as the last. The silence around me felt oppressive, but with every movement, I felt the emptiness pressing in, drawing me in like a powerful tide. No matter how far I walked, no matter how many steps I took, the world around me did not change. The shapes, the shadows I had seen earlier, now seemed distant, unreal. Were they just figments of my imagination? Had I hallucinated them in the depths of fear? I shook my head, trying to focus, trying to remain grounded in the reality I knew before. The real world. But that world was slipping further away with every passing second. The more I searched for it, the more it evaded me. And then it hit me. The world had never really been real. I had said that just moments ago, but now I truly understood it. It wasn't just the city I had left behind. It wasn't just the people. The whole concept of reality had been a fragile, fleeting thing, one that could be torn away at any moment, leaving nothing in its place but this void. I wasn't just trapped in an empty space. I was trapped in a dream that had collapsed. I didn't know how I knew this. I couldn't explain it. But the truth was undeniable, sinking deeper into my bones with every passing moment. And as I stood there, the last remnants of my old life slipping away, I realized something that made my heart freeze. There was no return. There was no escape from this place. There was no way back to the world I had known. This was it now. The nothingness. I looked around once more, seeing nothing but that same endless void. And then I heard it again. The hum. A low, rhythmic vibration. But it wasn't just sound anymore, it was felt in my chest. My body resonated with it, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the fabric of this place. It was all around me, vibrating through the very air. It was alive. And somehow, I knew that the hum was the key. It was the thing holding this reality together, the one force that kept it from collapsing completely. And just like that, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in an unnatural stillness. The weight of that silence was unbearable. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was alone, swallowed whole by the vast emptiness. And then, as if in response to my desperation, something began to form in the distance. At first, it was a mere flicker, a shimmer in the air, but soon it grew into something more solid. A figure. A shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline indistinct and shifting. It didn't have a face, at least, not one I could make out, but its presence was overwhelming. It was like a shadow, but not one that could be cast by light. It was something else. Something that belonged to this place. It moved slowly toward me, its form distorting and folding in on itself as it approached, as if it were made of smoke and mirrors. Each step it took echoed in the silence, louder than my heartbeat, and with every movement, the space around me seemed to bend, the air thickening as though it were becoming more solid. I stood frozen, my legs refusing to move, my mind unable to grasp what was happening. The figure continued to glide toward me, its presence filling the space, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up, but I couldn't. The hum had returned, now louder than ever, vibrating through my entire being. "You are here forever," the figure whispered. It wasn't a voice, not a sound in the traditional sense, but something more ancient, more powerful. It was a thought. A realization. I had never left. I had never been truly alive. I was a part of the void now. And as the figure reached me, I knew that there was no going back, no way to escape the endless emptiness that had claimed me. The last thing I felt was its cold presence closing in, swallowing me whole. And the darkness consumed me. The world was gone. The void was all that remained. And in that emptiness, I would fade away, a memory lost to the infinite, forgotten forever. I thought I had already fallen into the abyss, but as the darkness enveloped me, a strange sensation began to creep up from within. It wasn't the coldness of being consumed by the void, but a heat, a deep, unsettling warmth that began to spread throughout my body. It felt as if I were burning from the inside out. Was I dying? The question echoed through my mind, but there was no answer. Only the suffocating silence and the overwhelming sense that the world was no longer mine to understand. The warmth intensified, and I could feel something stirring beneath my skin, pushing against the very essence of who I was. Then, in the deepest, darkest corner of my mind, there was a flash. A vision, a memory. I saw my reflection in a cracked mirror, but it wasn't my own face that looked back at me. It was something wrong. The eyes were hollow, and the skin was pale, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for the body it belonged to. There was no life in the gaze. No humanity. Just emptiness. But before I could react, the mirror shattered, and the vision was gone. The warmth inside me began to grow unbearable, and I tried to scream, but my voice was lost to the silence. It felt as if my very soul was being pulled from me, wrenched away by an invisible force. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, I understood what had happened. I had never truly belonged in this world. I was never a part of it. I was only a fragment, a broken piece of a forgotten reality. The warmth had become unbearable now, and I thought my body might implode under the pressure. But then it stopped. Everything stopped. The sensation, the warmth, the fear, it all vanished in an instant. I was no longer being pulled, no longer burning from within. The void had released me. I opened my eyes, or at least, I thought I did. What I saw was not the familiar emptiness of the void, but a dark, foggy landscape stretching out before me. It was an odd place, distorted, yet familiar. The shapes of buildings loomed in the distance, but they were wrong, twisted. They seemed to flicker and shift, like mirages in a desert. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. The ground beneath me felt solid, but it was cold. The air tasted stale, and I could hear the faintest echo of voices in the distance. They were distorted, like murmurs from another time. I took a step forward, but my feet didn't make a sound. The ground felt soft, as if it were made of something other than earth. Like ash. The fog thickened, curling around me, obscuring my vision. And then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Indistinct. But unmistakable. You can't leave. The voice was familiar. It was the same voice that had echoed through the void, the one that had told me I couldn't escape. The voice that had driven me to the brink of madness. But this time, the voice wasn't alone. Other voices joined in, murmuring, chanting in unison, as though they had always been there, waiting. They surrounded me, closing in, drowning out everything else. You belong here. I froze, panic rising in my chest. The air around me thickened, almost solidifying, and I could feel something shifting in the fog. I could hear something moving within it, something watching, waiting. The landscape, now entirely engulfed in shadow, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The buildings, the ground, the fog, they were all part of the same unholy force, bending and warping as if they were made of a substance that could never be understood. No, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible above the deafening hum that now reverberated through the air. This isn't real. But as I said those words, I realized something horrifying. This was real. This was my reality now. This was the place where I belonged. The figures in the fog slowly materialized, their outlines emerging from the mist. They were shapeless at first, like shadows, but then they took form. They were people, or at least, they had been people. Now, they were mere echoes, stretched thin by time and memory, their faces unrecognizable. You are one of us, they whispered in unison. I tried to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped in this nightmare, bound by the very force that had brought me here. The fog thickened, suffocating me, until there was no air left to breathe. I was no longer a part of the world I had once known. No longer a person. I had become part of the void. Part of the endless night. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. There was no way out of the fog, no way to break free from the shadows. The empty night had claimed me, and I would never see the light again. I had disappeared into the porridge night. And there I would remain forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.